Hey John, how's it going?
Doing pretty good. How are you today?
Man, doing pretty well. Have you been seeing all the stuff going on with all these DDoS attacks recently?
Yes, absolutely. Been seeing some of the activity going on, trying to figure out and put the pieces together and find out
Yeah.
exactly, what their targets are and who they're attacking and why.
It's interesting that like there are all these new groups that pop up, but you still have like the big names, right? You have Killnet, Anonymous Sudan, No Name 057, um, and and like these big three groups are operating and making so much noise that I think all these smaller groups are starting to pop up because of that, right? They're starting to kind of see what these big groups are doing, and they're like, hey, we could do that, and so maybe we'll jump in and take a part in that. And the thing that's really interesting, right, is like when we think about how ransomware groups operate, how maybe some APTs operate those groups tend to operate more on like the dark web or more on like hidden platforms, things that like people can't really see, right? And we've seen that with ransomware groups, posting all the stuff on the dark web. They announce their attacks on dark web. But these groups tend to operate on Telegram. And I think that's pretty interesting because that's an open platform. You don't need any special tools to get there. And they're just like announcing everything they're doing. But one of the really interesting things from like the intel perspective is what they do from that. They use their attacks to promote their own purposes, but then they also like will recruit others to support their attacks. They'll go down and say, "Hey, we are attacking, XYZ, right? You should come join us in this attack." And they're not silent about their motivation, which is really interesting, right? Because you look at like what ransomware groups do or like what APTs do or some of these more advanced threat actors, and they're kind of silent about their motivation. And you have to sit there and kind of pick and choose and figure out what they're doing. But these groups are just upfront saying, hey, we're going to attack XYZ because we disagree with whatever.
So to level set the conversation, a distributed denial of service attack is a malicious attempt to disrupt normal traffic of a targeted server and service or network by overwhelming that target surrounding its infrastructure, right? So there's power in numbers. And
Yeah.
when you talk about, it's interesting how you say, they solicit the help and or, the services of other groups to join in on certain efforts. The DDoS attacks, they achieve effectiveness by utilizing multiple compromised computers, IoT devices, or anything else they can find on the internet by forming what is called a botnet, right?
Mhm.
So typically, a lot of people say, okay, well, yeah, you say computers and other things. Well, a lot of these botnets aren't made up of physical computers. A lot of these actors target other IoT devices and things that are on the network that have tremendous computing power that are not necessarily a computer. For instance, like you have like nowadays, everything is on the internet, right?
Yeah.
I went over a friend's house last week and they had a refrigerator that tells you like when your milk is low or when it's got weight scales and stuff and have like a menu, like a whiteboard menu on the front of it for like your shopping list and stuff. And you could tie it to Amazon or
Oh man.
Walmart to do shopping. So as time goes on and as globalization continues to happen and more devices are becoming, or I should say, more and more countries and fabrics are becoming more interconnected, we're seeing a lot more of these types of attacks because of all the low hanging fruit that exists. One of the things that pops out or stands out in my mind was the attack that happened on Sony for Sony PlayStation. I think that was in 2011 or something like that, where Anonymous brought down the PlayStation network for like 2 whole days.
Wow.
2 whole days. Like 70 something million customers were unable to log in and get on their gaming consoles and play other people because they were being DDoSed, right? So DDoS doesn't necessarily mean these botnets are made up of computers. They could be cameras, security devices, um, refrigerators, printer, anything that connects to the internet. But they usually go after things that have a little bit more computing power, such as, like gaming consoles and things of that nature that live and survive on these networks that connect to the internet.
So I have a question about that, right? Because you're saying all these tools and all these systems, fridges that are connected and security cameras and all that. Do these individuals have the technical knowledge to infiltrate all those devices, or are they like purchasing access to those devices or using tools that are already part of those botnets?
So typically your average home user or whatever, you most people don't know that they've been infected by a piece of malware, because a lot of these things happen in swaths, right? They can deploy, or if there's a vulnerability in a specific device, or I'm just going to use this, probably a bad example, but like a blink camera, like one of your home cameras or whatever, and you've had that device, like my parents, I think my parents have had the same security camera for like almost 7 years, right? So that thing has probably long been out of support by the vendor. And so without the lack of support, those cameras or those older devices, they become susceptible to a whole lot of different, we call them CVEs, or got different vulnerabilities that allow these attackers to take control of these devices and place them in what we call a botnet, to be able to issue commands to them to do different things. And like I said, like you alluded to earlier, as a single individual, my ability and or to do things at scale is limited, right? So if you take these companies who sell these botnets per se, you're talking hundreds of thousands of devices that are parts of these botnets, right? And so the object of the game is to overwhelm your target with legitimate traffic, or to confuse that individual and their IT department with what's legitimate and what's malicious traffic into their network, to consume all the resources and bring that device down, right? So I think the hardest part about that is fighting is the cost and the education, right? Because over time, and I don't know how many people replace TVs too. This is a better example, is like Fire TVs, or all of these interconnected TVs with all these apps nowadays. Within 3 to 5 years, that vendor stops making updates for that television.
Yeah.
And I don't know anybody, because I don't, right? I don't know anybody who's going out buying a new 4K TV every 3, 4 years, 5 years. You see what I'm saying? So I know my parents don't either. They've had the same TV for 10 years. So it's one of those things where the cost versus, and the education plays a lot into the development of a lot of these botnets, and these guys that leverage a lot of this software that automates the process for them, because all they have to do is deploy malicious software, and then it becomes part of their botnet to be able to issue C2 commands to. And then at that point, like I said, it's just a matter of it sitting and waiting. So it could go months without any traffic. You see what I'm saying? Without them using that bot. But as long as that bot is a part of that botnet, upon execution of certain commands and C2 commands, they can issue commands of that botnet or that particular bot to go and reach out for services from whatever their target is at that given time.
You're talking about en masse, right? You need these attacks to happen en masse, right? And these botnets allow them to do that. And we spoke a little bit about, like, they recruit others. But what we've noticed from kind of the intel side, right, is these groups will just go and start developing their own, right? We've heard of a tool called DDoSia. There's one called CC Attack. And these DDoS groups will just promote them on their Telegram and actually try and sell them to their users. So the people who follow them on Telegram will sit there and be able to buy access to these tools. So not only do the DDoS groups sit there and develop those technical capabilities or buy the access to the botnets, they repackage them and sell them to their users. So they're now making some money off of it, and they're in a sense being brokers. So we talked about how these smaller groups pop up, and if I'm not technically sound, if I don't know how to go in and, like you said, take control over a bunch of different systems, or where I'm going to find a botnet, but I see anonymous Sudan selling whatever their tool is, right? I can just sit there and say, well, I'll buy it, get access to it, and then I can create my own little DDoS group and start sending attacks to whoever I want, right? And so those tools are now becoming out there, so people without technical knowledge can now have those tools. And we saw that with the ransomware market, but I guess now it's happening kind of with the DDoS market as well. It's just you buy the tool, you click a button, you identify who you want your target to be, and it just sends loads and loads of traffic at them.
So with that being said too, just like you mentioned, is that we have to understand too about the technical aspect of what that tool is actually doing. And so in layman's terms, that tool is actually a rudimentary tool, because it's exploiting and taking advantage of what e-commerce is all about, right? we're in business to be able to communicate with customers, especially when you're talking about internet facing web pages that go like for sales and e-commerce and things of that nature, where your sole purpose is to sell a product. And so I have to be available, right? So availability is a big chunk of that. And that's exactly what they're exploiting. And in a more technical sense, these tools get after the OSI layer. So there's a thing called an OSI model, right? There's 7 layers of it. And they're taking advantage of the OSI model and weaknesses in the ideological stance of, hey, look, we know that these businesses have to take advantage of being available to be able to service customers. And then on the flip side of that, let me create a tool that just simply, because like your computer, every single time you reach out to a web page, it's requesting a service. That web page, it's a GET request. That web page comes out and it serves you up a page, right? When it serves you up a page, that takes up a fraction of resources to do that. Well, what happens if I send you, or this tool is designed to send you, I don't know, 100,000 requests in a second. And then I multiply that times 10,000 different bots at the same time. So that is where we stand at today, where they're just taking advantage of what's readily available to be able to cause stress and to take up resources on critical infrastructure for a business to be able to bring it down for a certain period of time and or cause that thing to crash and corrupt data. And typically when we're talking about the DDoS, it gets complicated, right? So there's typically 3 different types of DDoS attacks. And your first type is what we've been discussing, and what's probably the most prevalent and the most popular is going to be your HTTP flood attack, right? Because the HTTP flood attack uses that layer 7, like I told you about the OSI model. It's going to use that layer 7, and it takes a single HTTP request, and then it says, okay, hey, look, I'm going to take this request, I'm going to spread this request out amongst however many bots I have, and everybody requests this page or this URL at the same time, taking up all the resources of that particular that server or that network, to flood that network. These types of attack range from simple to complex, right? Because not only is that a layer 7 attack to be able to take advantage of an HTTP request, you can also vary what block and range of IPs you're coming from. So if you're coming from different parts of the world at the same time, maximizing that effort, you can change exactly what user agent strings you're using. For instance, vary up whether you're coming from a Windows host in a user bot, or you're coming from a Linux host and using different user agent strings. And a lot of this boils down to the confusion and the constant pressure you're putting on that organization and their IT department to be able to deal with it. The second type of DDoS attack is going to be like a SYN flood. So it takes advantage of the TCP/IP protocol stack. And a SYN flood is taking advantage of opening half-open connections, because you have a handshake in a TCP/IP in the protocol stack. You have a SYN, a SYNAC, and then an ACK. And then those 2 computer systems create that session, right? And then they pass data back and forth. Well, they figured out that, hey, I don't even have to go through all of that to be able to establish a connection. What I can do is just flood the network with hundreds of thousands of SYN packets to get that computer or get that server to use up its memory and resources and potentially crash it that way. And then the third one that you see, and it's usually this one is usually done on a grander scale with more sophisticated actors, is called a volumetric attack. And it takes advantage of layers 3 and 4 as well. But the difference in this one is a DNS. They call it DNS amplification attack. And it's like, it's pretty much where they're spoofing the target's address to hundreds of thousand DNS requests and waiting for those replies to come back from those multiple DNS servers. And so if you do that over time, it continues to ramp up from 100,000 requests, and then exponentially from there, causing it to take down resources as well. So I think that from that perspective, so those are the 3 main types of DDoS attacks that occur.
As you were explaining those attacks, I was thinking, like, why would someone want to do this, right? Like, what would be the effectiveness of this? And it's interesting because you and I have like two different understandings of why they would want to do it, right? I kind of come from like their motivation, right? But you kind of have that technical of like, why would they want to do something that is effective, but it's not getting into a system? And like for me, like why they do that is if I don't like a target, right? If my motivation is, I want to target everyone who's pro Russia. Well, I'm pro Russian, but I want to target anyone who's like anti Russia, right? I can just sit there and just hit sites over and over and over again, and that country or that website is just inaccessible, right? And I can just create a little bit of like pain for the adversary. And we've seen that. These groups do that all the time, right? When the US started sending, weapons over to Ukraine, right? You were seeing all these hits just hitting airports and stuff like that. And they weren't doing a lot of damage to them, but like it made the news, right? And so it's interesting because those three attacks, the three types you do, from what we see, they don't do much damage besides just being annoying. They do get propaganda. They do get on the news, right? And if I can sit here and start throwing attacks at someone and say, and then I can get the news talking about like, oh, Killnet has started targeting airports, or Anonymous Sudan has started doing XYZ, right? And then you start creating that panic in the community of like, oh my God, we're being attacked. People are going to start freaking out. And then these groups will start transitioning. But I guess the question though is you said that these attacks last for like an hour, maybe a little bit more, and they don't really go past like that front page of the website. So what is your analysis of the effectiveness, right? Like I don't see them as being very effective in a kind of attack, and I see it effective of like why they do it, their motivation, and like what they try and get out of it. But from the technical side, like what is the effectiveness of these attacks? What does it do to the systems?
That's definitely a loaded question. And with that being said, so it's difficult for defenders. So as a defender, when we talk about a DDoS attack, being able to identify it first is one thing. And the typical way people know that something is wrong is because you see, let's say you're logging in the morning and you see your website isn't responding, or your e-commerce site isn't responding. And so at that point, you're losing money instantly. You're losing access to customers. You're losing access to your business. No longer is able to be communicating with the world, right? How you make your money, or how you're getting your message out there to the world at large. And as a defender, it's really, really, really difficult to defend against for several reasons. One of which is you have to find it. You're going to have to locate it. Either suspicious amounts of traffic that originate from a single IP range that seem like they're requesting a lot of the same pages over and over and over again. So something has to happen where resources are being taken up, and then you have to go and look at that, and it'll jump out at you looking at traffic analysis for the most part. A flood of traffic from users who share the same behavioral patterns. You can look for unexplained requests from a single endpoint to a certain page. Or you can look for odd traffic patterns, right? Or odd hours of the day, like something weird is happening and you see spikes in computer or CPU utilization and things of that nature as well. So it's just really, really hard to pinpoint exactly the cause of a DDoS attack. And then on the backside of that, what's really crazy is there's not many people, well, aside from your Fortune 500s, right? Because if I'm a mom and pop shop, or I'm one of these other companies that is just me and my ISP, and you don't have the backing, or you're not hosting your services by the big three, whether it's Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, or somewhere in the cloud, you only are limited to what your response actions to a DDoS attack could be, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, for a lot of people who don't have the monetary resources, and it's you and your ISP dealing with a DDoS attack, you're limited to like, I don't know, maybe 3 options, right?
Yeah.
You can do like they have what's called black hole routing, right? It's where you're being overwhelmed, you reach out, contact your ISP, and your ISP is like, yeah, we're agreeing, you're under attack currently, and we can see the traffic, and there's not too much we can do about it other than black hole routing, which is where they send all of that traffic to mitigate it crashing your network. They send all of those incoming packets to essentially what's called the bit bucket, right? That router discards all of the packets that are coming to your destined IP address. Well, that's not optimal, right? Because you're losing legitimate customers along with that malicious traffic, right? So black hole routing it was the only option available 10, 15 years ago, right? But now with the addition of different tools like you talked about too, there are other mitigation steps that you can throw in there too. Like one of them is called rate limiting, where you can have the devices on your network, which is like your firewalls and routers, they can inspect that traffic and you can limit the number of requests per second. Because if you notice, like a user clicking on something is going to be every second or two because they're reading content on a page. Whereas if these requests are coming from a tool, it's hundreds of thousands a second, right? So you can tell your equipment, your routers, your switches, your firewalls, you can tell them that, hey, look, we're going to limit the number of requests per server that the server will accept in order to try to limit the CPU usage to be able to try to mitigate your way through it. But once again, not the great option or not the best option, because all that's going to do is slow down and give you time to implement or figure out another way to mitigate that attack, especially if that attack lasts hours. Or in the instance of that Sony PlayStation attack, they did that and they brought Sony PlayStation down for 20 or 48 hours. It was 2 whole days. It was 2 whole days. And then for regular, I should say for normal sized businesses, you can do what's called a WAF, like a web application firewall. And that just sits in the DMZ in front of your front facing web, your web instance. And what it does is it protects your web instance as a reverse proxy. And it looks at and annotates the number of connections that are being made. And it tries to discern which ones were legitimate connections and which ones are malicious connections based off of heuristics and other metrics that it deems necessary to protect it. And then the last way, which the large majority of folks don't necessarily have the access to, which is what's called Anycast, network diffusion, which is what your cloud providers can provide, right? Because nobody else has a global presence. Your Amazons, your Googles, and your Microsofts, being as though they have a global presence, and somebody's attacking you with, Lord knows, millions and millions of requests per second, what Anycast network diffusion can do for you is, well, it does for them. And the reason why cloud services, that's a plus for those guys and where people are migrating towards it, is that they'll absorb that traffic and they can offload that traffic to different places around the world to absorb all of that traffic. And it will seem like a blip on you'll have a hiccup in the beginning until they invoke it, and then that network traffic gets dispersed across the globe, and then your website continues to function as needed. So those are the different things that it's hard for a defender. It's extremely hard for a defender, and it's very easy for an attacker in that instance.
So it was interesting. One thing you said was is attacks in weird hours, and I want to highlight that because when we study these attackers, when we look at what they do on their Telegram page, we see that a lot of these attacks begin around 2 a.m. on the East Coast and go to around 11 a.m. on the East Coast, right? Which is a really weird time for that attack to occur, because most people are still asleep at the beginning of it, and like companies are just kind of starting on. So I guess you see the attack happening when you log in. But what we've been looking at and what we're tracking with those is we can actually make an assessment on the location of these threat groups based on their attacks, right? Like if you're in the US, why would you start an attack at 2 a.m., right? Why are you going to sit there and start an attack at 2 a.m. when most people are asleep and aren't using that system? However, if you're located in Eastern Europe or Moscow, Russia, right, that is early morning for you. That is that is maybe late morning, early afternoon for you, right? And so we've been able to look at these weird times attacks like you brought up, right? And see we can assess that they're not from the US. These attacks are not starting from the US. These groups are not in the US. And it's in their names, but there's a group called Anonymous Sudan. Well, their attacks are starting at the exact same time as, say, a group that we know is based in Russia, meaning they might be based nearby. They might be in a similar time zone, right? And it's really interesting. They launch these attacks when most people in the US are asleep, right? When maybe you have, maybe one defender sitting at a computer, right, on the 24-hour, like in their 24-hour SOC, maybe sitting there, right, one defender, but not a lot of traffic. And then it's like the traffic starts picking up. But it's interesting because they launch the attacks all at the same time. So if they're attacking, Central Europe, they still launch them at like 2 a.m. Eastern time, right? Which is more effective there, but not effective in the US. And so we can kind of get this picture of how these groups operate and why they operate based on the times that they do their attacks. And so we've been able to like look at some of who they attack, why they attack, and kind of get that picture of, okay, so when the attacks come at these weird hours, it's because they're awake and they're operating. This is like their 9 to 5 is to start launching these attacks, right? And one thing, I'll go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it's tough as a defender. Like I said, that if it comes at 2 a.m. or 9 a.m. in the morning, I mean, it's just tough to be able to react to, especially a distributed DDoS attack. You know what I'm saying? Like if you're doing a DDoS on somebody, a lot of times they're not using just one of those techniques we discussed, right? They'll use, it's called multi-vector. They'll use something at layer 7, like the HTTP flood, and then they'll come in and couple it with either or, the SYN flood or the DNS amplification. So they're affecting multiple layers of the OSI model, causing their attack to amplify exponentially to be able to take down different networks. So I just think that it's so much harder for a defender than it is for the attacker, especially like you said, during those off-peak hours when you don't have all hands on deck to be able to respond.
And it's also, there's no indication of why this attack's, or like when this attack is going to occur, right? It's not like they're saying, hey, we're going to attack XYZ. They announce it ahead of time, right? But like right before they start that attack, or they announce it as they're attacking. You don't know why they're attacking this, mom and pop shop, or when they're going to do it, right? You can't prepare. But what's interesting is one thing that we've been tracking, we've been able to see, is that some of these groups are very cyclical in their nature, right? They'll start by targeting, maritime industries, or they'll target a nation, right? And then a month later, they'll move to, not even a month, maybe a couple of weeks later, they'll move to like aviation or another country. And then, 2 months later, they're moved back to maritime, and they just kind of go in these circles, right? And so what we've been able to track is like, oh, so, it's been 3 months since they targeted maritime. We're probably likely to see these groups start targeting maritime of X country at this time. And so as much as they've been able to, start building their tools and launch these attacks, they're not hiding, especially their bigger attacks, they're not hiding like when they're going to happen.
Like you just alluded to, a lot of that has a lot to do with politics, right? So when it comes to politics, there's a lot of these things that are driven solely based off of what people believe in, beliefs of what's right and wrong and who's supposed to be supporting what. So when we're talking about nation state adversaries and how they're hopping different industries to be able to do it, I think it's tied to a lot of what's going on globally in the political space, right? So if you keep your ears to the ground in the political space, I think you'll get a good indication of where and what's a hotbed for the next attack.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. They don't hide why they do it. And so you understand what their motivations are, and you'll get an understanding. So I guess kind of the last thing I want to talk about, right, is what do you think the next steps of these groups are going to be, right? Like from our perspective, like from the Intel side, we look at these groups and we say, well, next step is probably in a couple of months they're going to, attack maybe the same sector or the same nation again. We look at the political thing and we kind of know their next steps. But one thing that I've been thinking about is, we talked about it earlier, but the next steps in selling of their DDoS groups, like their DDoS tools, right? Like, because they're promoting that. So I'm wondering if maybe the next couple of months, maybe next year, we start seeing DDoS as a service start popping up as like people selling that, right? But I want to get your thoughts. Like, what do you think from like the kind of malware analyst side, like the technical side, what do you think the next steps of some of these groups or tools or DDoS attacks might be?
So I think where we're headed right now, and what's scary to everybody else is like, so when these big old huge attacks happen, right? So
Mhm.
you've exposed or you've burned that tool at that point in time, because now that signature is loose on the network, and those botnets are usually broken up by the government by using like a reverse tracking mechanism where they go through and look
Mhm.
at the different exit or entry points across the globe of where these VPSs were, or where that traffic originated from, and then they go after the botnets, right? So you've burned
Yeah.
that. So what's really, really interesting to see, as well as concerning, is that that's why it takes so long between like a Sony attack or something like that, where you're having hundreds of thousands of devices attacking a single organization. When they did that, I believe it was the FBI and some other folk, they broke up that botnet and they seized a couple of different VPSs across the country to be able to mitigate that, right? So now that company or whoever was selling that botnet as a service has to go back and reinfect another 100,000 devices,
Yeah.
right? But unfortunately for a defender, once again, there's a thing called AI that's on the verge. So if they can manage a way to leverage and to be able to reconstitute that in a way that they're reconstituting faster than the government can keep up, and or different organizations can keep up in thwarting those capabilities, it'll be like playing whack-a-mole, right? Because if I
Yeah.
can reconstitute hundreds of thousands of botnet individuals or victims overnight using an AI source or some sort of machine learning to be able to go out here and reinfect another 100,000 overnight, then that's going to be extremely dangerous. Because, like
Yeah.
I said, once again, the ability to take down a network utilizing what an interconnected network is supposed to be for, which is sharing data, so that's its purpose. And so it's extremely hard to stop. But once again, I just think it's going to be interesting. We're in a really, really delicate space right now when it comes to the capabilities and tooling that's going to come in the future, especially as AI and all this machine learning is starting to come online full force and being used by
Yeah.
not only APTs, you're having hacktivists and individuals out here using the same technology and tooling. So it's going to get really interesting. It's going to get
Yeah.
interesting.